Hey, so hi, everybody. I am Adam Egypt Mortimer, and I am here talking to Rodney Ascher, who has directed A Glitch in the Matrix. And I'm thrilled to be talking to him. I love all of his movies, and this one is really, I think, particularly fascinating. And I just want to quickly shout out Alamo Drafthouse and Magnolia for putting us together to talk. Rodney, hey man, how you doing?
I'm good, man. Good to see you. I just watched your movie last night, and I did it in VR, which was kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean that certainly fits what your movie felt like, which was that we're sort of peeling ourselves through layers and layers of mediation, and so it's even in the funhouse moment of I'm talking to you through Zoom and you're telling me you watched a movie I made in a virtual reality environment. I mean, it's. I guess I feel bad that I didn't come up with a wacky brain exposed avatar to interview you with.
Yeah, well, I mean, the irony that this movie is coming out in a world where we have no choice in the matter of how much time we have to spend in front of screens and communicating with each other, with little video boxes, um, is something that is not lost on me.
Well, that's something that was immediately fascinating to me watching this movie because you're a filmmaker who in across your three big documentaries, you create a world that they take place in. You create a tone for them that is very specific to the subject matter, and I think very specific to you. And one thing that was fascinating watching Glitch was that I remember speaking to you a long time ago, and you had for the most part already shot this movie, so it was not shot virtually because of COVID, right? This all of these choices about how you made this movie were an entirely aesthetic choice and preceded the pandemic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we shot all those interviews. We did them on Skype because I wasn't that familiar with Zoom. We did that back in 2019. And the structure of the movie was, the cement was starting to dry well before the end of the year. So, I mean, the fact that sort of Skype interviews have been normalized, in one media after another in that time since, is another one of those sort of weird ironies that have sort of a way of happening around these projects. It's a small thing, but the fact that other VR thriller Bliss like premiered on the same day as us, and that was
Yes,
something I only heard about it with like a week or two's notice.
I
Like
think
very very strange timing. Something's in the air.
I randomly wound up watching both Glitch and Bliss on the same day.
Oh wow!
It really
How did they work
started to
together?
have this sense to me of I guess we're all obsessed with what is real and what's not real and how overly mediated it might be. I think the way that I started to feel about halfway or two-thirds of the way through your movie was beginning to really notice that there wasn't a single shot of something organic, right? Like I was just dying for like the most boring B-roll of a park or a tree or like the kinds of things you normally see in a documentary that are such filler and so dull. Family pushing a baby carriage in Central Park. I was like desperate to feel something real because you had constructed this like stifling digital feeling, and I felt like that then really paid off when you got to the Virginia shooter and how and how dark it came. But like, so was this kind of an initial ideal for you to construct like the realm that it would take place in?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that we spent a little time figuring out how to do was how to create the exteriors, in Google Earth. And I mean, that technology had come a long way by the time we started. They even released something, Google Earth Studio, which sort of allows you to animate within. So, um, there's shots like, we're imagining Paul's childhood drive to St. Louis, and we're able to scout locations and animate approaches into the city. And on the one hand, it tricks your eye because the light is all very natural, because these are all photographs that are being, sort of laid over on whatever wireframe they're able to create. But if you look at anything very closely, you can see the smear, the degradation, the places where cars melt into the asphalt, where lamps bleed into trees. And I mean, we wanted to push that further. At one point, I remember we were trying to do like there's a whole sort of car accident scene in Mexico. And we thought, wouldn't it be really interesting to set that in Google Earth exactly on that mountain that Alex is describing that story in? But I think Willie Gibson has that phrase that the future is not evenly distributed, and well, neither is Google Earth. That for talking about downtown Los Angeles, New York, major cities, everything is built out and photographed and pops up into 3D, but there's still huge swaths of the planet where things are just flat satellite photos. And that happened to be the case, back in Cuernavaca. So, we set that in that grid world, which became something that we built out in different colors for each of the characters.
So is an idea like that, I mean, what I was thinking about how, Room 237 is also this like very constructed world, right? You never see any of the faces of the people who are talking. So it's entirely footage and these voices that you're trying to track on all of their labyrinths. And Nightmare has this kind of, I don't know, domestic surrealism, right? And that you're doppelganging the characters you're talking to by having actors play them in the nightmares. Did these kind of things, like the tone, the kind of the construction of the world, is that something you arrive at early on in the process? Or is that, are you sorting through thousands of hours of footage and then starting to have an idea about how you want to create it?
I have sort of broad strokes ideas early on. The fact that the idea that this would be digitally animated made all sorts of sense, for all sorts of reasons very early on. Though for a little while, I toyed with the idea of doing the reenactments sort of on a backlot, and inserting digital characters into those kind of facades. I mean, it's a different sort of artificial world, a different sort of construction. But I tend to kind of overthink these and want to get, really conceptual in a way that, the look and feel of the film, the visual language reflects on the story, reflects on the subject. That I don't have much of a background, and I think this is probably fairly obvious, in sort of in journalism, right? But so I see these, as much more in the tradition of storytelling, something like, an eerie version of This American Life. And that show, uses music and sound effects, very dramatically in order to build atmosphere and to make these stories really come to life. And I'm trying to do, the same thing with the visuals. And in the case of the Nightmare, putting everything in the soundstage, we tried to find sort of maybe sort of a weird little parallel between like the soundstage and the subconscious, that, it's a black box where you move around, sort of minimal sets to recreate, these spaces. And here, all digital, just made, it's a movie about getting lost in digital worlds. So the idea that we would do it in a digital style, and really try to push that, right? That there's, I think, 4 kinds of animation. There's the avatars that Mindbomb and Lorenzo Fonda executed. There's Davy Force. If you remember the Chickening, him and his partner Nick did the Chickening a few years ago, right? That amazing Shining remix that sort of this, acid drenched KFC commercial.
Is that how you met them? Did you see that and say, I need to work with these maniacs? Or
we had friends in common for a long time, but that one certainly brought us closer together very quickly. And he did the stuff with like the guy in the movie theater and the operating room and the spaceships. So the idea of like the avatars and some of that other animation is artificial by design. sort of evocative of kind of, video game resolution and video game style. But, with the day before stuff, we wanted to kind of push up into that uncanny valley of the Polar Express, or a deep fake to get it
purposefully horrific, like things that are trying to be real but actually just make you feel creepy.
Right, because they're just close enough to fool you for a second. Like the texture map of the skin has pores in tiny little hairs that sort of trick your eye if you just look at it for a second. Then again, we had the Google Earth stuff, and actually one of our producers, Colin Frederick, went and sort of did a crash course Google Earth Academy to whip out that animation and be scouting all the sites all over the planet to try to find those perfect exteriors. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of learning as we go because the technology was so new. I mean, like Lorenzo, who was acting out the avatars. Well, this is a perfect example, looking at us in these boxes, that he would look at the interviews and then he put on this motion capture suit. Like, it's just gotten to the point where you can afford that kind of a thing on a indie doc budget, right? Like, it's not a Lord of the Rings kind of setup where there's 10,000 cameras in this green world. It's one rubber suit plugged into a laptop. Yeah. And Lorenzo would sort of watch the performances of the original interviews and interpret it with his body language and map that onto those avatars. So
was he actually like, if when the guy he smokes a vape, or right, these really human moments that happens, was that animation? Like, was he looking at what they do and then recreating it in something?
Yeah, or recreating it or interpreting it for clarity or emphasis.
Yeah.
And that was a funny bit. I mean, the vape humanizes him a little bit, but he also very quickly goes to talk about, the computer chips inside of a vape and how, of all the obscure little places that a digital world might find itself trapped in, that SD card inside the micro SD chip inside of a vape would be an especially tragic one.
Did you, because I love the characters, I love the designs of those avatars so much, and I mean, and you really did push like the humor and the pathos of them. The lion as the little kid version, and it's the same avatar but shrunken down, and like we're talking about, the vaping Anubis is just so many levels of cosmically hilarious to me. Did you have other character designs that you worked on and threw away, or like you were sketching tons of different things? Like, how did you land on who got to be what and why? And did the interviewees have any input in who they got to become?
Yeah, well, they just had to put their trust in us. I kind of explained what we were doing early on, and they were okay with it. And I may or may not have told you, but you're a link in this chain, because the guy who created these avatars, Chris Burnham, who's a unbelievable comic artist with a real flair for character design, I met at one of your Halloween parties a couple years back.
Yeah, I remember. Oh, he's a great comic book artist. He does a lot of stuff with Grant Morrison. He did all of Morrison's Batman and Robin. He did
Nameless, which is unbelievable, and Batman Incorporated, or Die. He's just amazing. So we were nerding out in one corner of your party, not talking to other human beings, but it led to us being able to do this together, where he watched an early cut of the movie where you could still see the people's faces. And he would see maybe my really, really crummy sketches for what was going to happen in the reenactments. So he sort of had a sense of who these characters were, what they were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And, because, I'm a comic book nerd in my own right, that, we were able to bounce around ideas and, and say, maybe this guy is a little bit more like the Alex, the brain in the helmet and the sort of the militaristic outfit. So we were talking about ideas of characters like Judge Dredd or Martial Law, as kind of inspirations for him, right? And then like Thundercats for Paul, who felt to me, almost like, I think we sort of described him as like a king in exile, right? So then he would do sketches and explore them, and some of them he hit like immediately, right? The brother Mistwood, Anubis, and the tuxedo. I think that was immediate.
Uh-huh.
And Jesse went through a couple of interesting turns. I mean, because he talked about being really into Mobius, he was doing these really cosmic Mobius style sketches. One of them was kind of a portrait of the real Jesse, but inside of like this floating chair, kind of like who's the character in the New Gods? Metron. But a chair that was also like his own head.
Like Mordok.
Mordok. Yeah. Well, yeah. Modok is the AIM character with the giant head and the little hands.
Yeah.
Metron, I think is his name, is a new god who is kind of, I don't know if who's always like floating around in sort of a hovering chair.
Yeah. Is it Metatron? Is it Metron or Metatron? Because Metatron is the angel that it might have been named after.
Well, we must stop everything and find out.
Somebody
all work must stop. And that was a great design, but one thing we realized was since 90% of the scene was heads and shoulders up, that we wouldn't see the chair. So we simplified to the astronaut, but it still had sort of a cosmic Mobius sort of quality. And once we had all those sketches together, the animation team were able to, build out these 3D models based on the drawings, and then bring them to life both in the interviews and in the reenactments.
Was any of that going through your mind, like in the moment when you're interviewing these people, you're looking at them going, you're hearing what they're saying, and you're in the moment, but you're also like, someday you're going to be a cosmic cat thing?
I had no idea what they were going to be. I didn't have the imagination at that point. And early on, we were still not exactly sure what the animation process was going to be like. I think at one point we toyed with the idea that maybe a different illustrator would draw each character in a different way, and that this character would be stop motion, and this character would be 2D cell animation, and this would be 3D, and this one would be sort of an animoji. But as we thought about it and we started to do tests, the idea that they would all come from the same hand and feel, I like the idea that they sort of feel like video game characters, and maybe like
they're in the same universe,
Yeah.
like they're in a consensual hallucination, to again quote a William Gibson kind of thing.
Yeah, there's all the idea that these are sort of video game characters on their days off, right? Like, what's that? There's that Warner Brothers cartoon with the sheepdog and the coyote, like after beating each other with clubs and chasing one another off of cliffs, they punch out and they go into the break room and catch up on the gossip.
Yeah.
That maybe is sort of that moment with these characters. I always love those times when a larger than life character just starts to act very naturally. And the same thing happens, my kid plays a lot of, I've got a 10-year-old and he plays a lot of games, and he plays a lot of Fortnite. And, Fortnite isn't just a game that he plays. He hooks up with his friends from both, LA, but also in other parts of the country. It's not just a game, it's a place where they go and they hang out, and they, if they're not in a battle royale, they're just kind of chatting and catching up, but they're communicating through these, 7-foot tall cybernetic warriors. And maybe trying to get, a little bit of that flavor of the kind of weirdness of the disassociation, right? Of your brain is kind of like your flesh body is less important in those interactions than your digital one.
Yeah. And the sounds your meat flaps make.
Exactly. Well, and you saw that meme, you saw that video today on Twitter that I think that instantly became a joke of that lawyer who couldn't turn off the cat filter.
Yeah, it was the ultimate. He said, I'm a real person. I'm live. I'm real. I am not a cat. There's nothing more 2021 than an old lawyer man saying, I am not a cat, having to clarify, like with all sincerity, I am not a cat.
But actually he is a cat, right? We're experiencing him as a cat. More people know him as a cat than have ever known him as a human being, whoever this guy is.
In some sense, he is a cat now, right? He was wrong. He was
that cat is a character that millions of people know and love.
Yeah. I have to ask how you find the people to be in your movies. How did you find these particular people? Are there, is it like this nationwide search for obsessive? And I also, I mentioned this to I think on text the other day, and it blew my mind. But I know Alex Levine. He engineered and produced my first band's metal album, our demo tape. So I've known that guy for like a long time, and even though he was in this movie, a cone, a cylinder head with an exposed brain, I was still like, wait a minute, I know that guy. I didn't realize he thought we were in a simulation, but I do know him, and what he's saying tracks.
Yeah, no, you told me that, I don't know, maybe a week ago. And then when I was rewatching the movie before, another one of these, I was struck that one of the first things he says is six, is like, that notion of 6 degrees of separation. And isn't it a strange coincidence that you know somebody and I know somebody and we both know the same people? That's not a coincidence at all.
Right.
It's a function of the fact that there's less people on this earth than you really think.
Yeah, he's trying to mathematically claim that there's only 100,000 people on the planet, yeah. which is clearly true because I know him, and I'm also was like lifelong buddies with a guy from your first movie with J.F. Ryan from Room 237. So I am proof that we are in a very closed loop of.
Yeah, and I know other people who know John Fell Ryan and know him from completely different, corners of life.
But so how do you find them? Like, how do you find a guy like Anubis in a tuxedo and a guy like?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we do is we create a place where they can find us. So we announced that we're doing the film. Mm-hmm. Boing Boing wrote a piece about it, and we set up a thing on Facebook and a Google Doc, different places where people could reach us. And before long, we had 100 stories of people who had. Who had their take on life in the simulation, and then it became about a question of which ones are the most interesting, which ones are the most personal and surprising, which ones hit different aspects of this story that we're trying to tell, right? And I interview, maybe 20 of them, and then in an early cut, I think we used, maybe 7 or 8 before, these 4 became, sort of the focus. Or at least the focus of kind of that category outside of, those other, the sort of experts, and then Josh, who is sort of Josh Cook, who is, sort of, well, he's sort of his own category, right?
So does that mean like your screening process, your casting process, and shooting the movie are all sort of happening at the same time? Like you're not doing a lot of preliminary interviews with these people. You're filming them, and then as you construct the movie, you decide to keep them or not?
Exactly. I mean, one of the nice things about doing these interviews on Skype is, there's barely any cost. Mm-hmm. Like when we were doing The Nightmare, it was a similar process where we set up a place and many people reached out to us, and, sort of half the people in The Nightmare were folks who reached out to us, and others were people that we pursued based on something they had written or said, or something I knew about them. But, just the nuts and bolts cost of production, right? We were traveling and filming at night and filming in these people's houses. So we had to be much more particular and do sort of, preliminary interviews with some of those folks before 7 of us get on a plane to Detroit to talk to the one guy who, right, whose phone exploded.
Yeah.
But in the course of this one, it was more like, I'll talk to a ton of them. It doesn't cost me anything other than the time it takes to talk with them, right? Mm-hmm. Although there's also the time we actually do the interview, and they probably go from 1 to 4 or 5 hours if somebody had enough that we did multiple interviews. That's like the smallest amount of time compared to breaking those interviews down to their component parts to be able to sort of get our heads around what each one really offered, or even just to listen to it a couple times and break them down into bullet points.
Yeah. I think that the thing that is, becoming more and more sort of clear and fascinating in your movies is your attention, like your obsessive design of the world that it lives in, but that it's really about the people and your sort of compassionate relationship to people who are extremely obsessed with things, right? And so it feels to me like your movies are sort of that you have an obsession with obsession. You know, to sort of look at it that way, that like what you're interested in a movie like this is less about are we or are we not living in a simulation, but it's more asking the questions, why are we obsessed with
Sure.
that?
Or let's meet the people whose
Yeah,
lives have been impacted by their belief in simulation theory, or let's discover what happened to them to make them believe it, and then have them reflect back on it of, well, what does that mean for them? Um,
and do you feel like, you know, because I know in Nightmare you talked about seeing you know, a 2-second shot in Natural Born Killers that reminded you of like your own sort of like
yeah,
sleep paralysis vision experience, and so, you know, and clearly Room 237 is, you know, these are all people who are so sort of surrounded by film imagery and the meaning of film that it becomes, you know, a sort of an obsessive labyrinth of thinking, which you yourself are then executing in making these movies. So, you know, what is there sort of like is there a point of empathy or a point of interaction, you know, in the case of this one with their obsessions or with their sort of, I don't know, solipsistic belief or their, you know, search for what reality is made of? Is that something that you are seeing yourself in them or connecting to them on that sort of level?
yeah. Well, I mean, we're on the same kind of trip, right? That I'm trying to get my head around this idea, and this is something, you know, and this is something that they've been wrestling with, only more intensely, more personally, and longer. I mean, I might think, you know, go back to 237. You know, I'm absolutely fascinated with The Shining, but these folks have gone deeper for longer than you know, in a way that, um, you know, I might say that, you know, there's sort of more intense versions of me, you know, that we share similar obsessions, but I rather get their points of view than lecture about it myself, because I'm not as interesting a case study in any of these subjects than these folks are.
Right.
If that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I think it goes back also to This American Life, right? Like there might be a This American Life episode on money, and they'll say, here's 5 stories, you know, of people who had, you know, some crazy thing went down involving money in their life, and they tell the story, and then they reflect back on what it means and what money means to them in an abstract way. And that's a very different model than, you know, what a CNBC stockbroker talking about the market.
Sure.
And that's, you know, sort of the model that I'm using in these things. And yeah, I mean, I think another way that I often try to put it is, you know, one thing I've been trying to do with all 3 of these, and maybe, you know, a short here or there too, is, you know, to let the audience see the world through the eyes of, you know, through the eyes of somebody else, through the eyes of somebody who feels something like this, you know, really, really deeply.
Yeah, and I think that's where your the sense of empathy for these characters comes in so strongly, or the degree to which the glitch is philosophical or about philosophy. I felt like it's presenting philosophy in an emotional way, you know, and like you say, that you're sort of talking to people that have dug deeper into this. Like, I don't know, I think it's such a common feeling. When I was growing up, I thought a lot about what if I'm the only thing that's real and everything around me is unreal,
Sure.
and how do we not know? And that really drove me when I went to college to then study philosophy and, you know, get very into this brain in a vat, you know, kind of world, and learn about these kind of things. But at a certain point, it felt to me like, okay, this is a way to that it can be helpful to understand the world, but it's clearly not the world. And I don't know, I think there's a certain thing that can happen maybe on an emotional level where your philosophy can change. And and so I'm wondering, is that a place where you were coming from? Was that like, were you always wondering about if you could trust your senses, and because they say the same thing in Nightmare, I mean, that's also there's moments in Nightmare where they're saying it's essentially, it's not a computer simulation, it's a simulation of neurons and perception, and our perception is wrong, and only when you're asleep do you have the veil is turned back and you can see the demons that really surround us.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the question in Nightmare, right? Are these things that people see something that comes from inside or something that comes from outside? And this one asks some similar questions, but maybe on a larger scale, because we're moving from dreams of the subconscious to the nature of reality.
But this was, I mean, long before we had The Matrix, long before we had Philip K. Dick, we had constructions like all the world's the stage and
Sure.
we're just players, or we had constructions about all the world is a dream, or all of these different kinds of things. And so what this weird kind of fusion of the movie The Matrix, which presented a ancient consistent human idea in a vivid way that made it in some sense more literal than I think philosophically it's meant to be, or on the other hand, maybe more visceral.
Well, certainly more visceral. I mean, the Matrix, it has a lot of philosophy in it, but it doesn't smell like homework.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, it's I think I forgot the other point.
It wasn't a question so much as it was something thematic. I mean, I guess I could frame the question, when you're looking at all your characters that were in your movie, this is a philosophical tradition. Sure. or a skepticism or maybe an emotional problem that we all have. Like, how the fuck do I know that I'm not the only real thing?
Well, and real can be substituted with important too, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's plenty of people who don't believe that we're living in a computer simulation, but sure treat a lot of people like crap.
Well, that's an absolutely fascinating analogy, right? So there's I think a relationship between literally believing that it's a simulation and acting like nobody else matters. And there's an interesting connection there, and I think and it really just it's so haunting when you get to the Virginia shooter in your movie, because I think it is it's like across all three of your movies we see people who we can relate to, because we are all desperately trying to understand what reality is, and we're wondering is the reality that I'm in fucked up? But what The Matrix specifically said was, the reality that we're in is fucked up, and you can take control of it by shooting and punching your way out of it, which I think is so fascinating. Jean Baudrillard, who they had asked to be in the movie, turned it down, right, and said he wrote the book Simulacrum.
Well, you see that book, right, that he holds the that little thing in.
And he has this very pithy thing that he presumably said, which was, the Matrix is exactly the kind of movie that the Matrix would make. and I think that it's so fascinating. But when I've been thinking about that, when you put it in terms of what we see in your film, it's like it creates, instead of for some people it creates sort of, instead of a organic Gnostic, maybe the world is bigger, it creates this idea of like, I will shoot all of these non-existent people, and I wonder if it's the desperation to, in the same way that your people in Nightmare desperately want to tear themselves out of the nightmare they're having. Like, are we all living in this world that we are increasingly feeling like is a nightmare? There's got to be some cheat code. There's got to be some way to shoot my way out of this, and so it might be sort of philosophically unsound, but it becomes, I don't know, a sense of panic, a sense of urgency, a sense of action.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily have the answer to big questions like that. But I mean, one thing I've certainly noticed about simulation theory, online that is often used as a sort of a pressure valve, right? Something absurd or appalling happens in the news, and that's proof that we're living in a simulation, that the simulation is misfiring, that there's a glitch, and in a way, therefore, it's okay because this world doesn't matter. And using it as a metaphor and using it as a way to joke around like that, I imagine that's therapeutic, for some folks.
Right,
But I think you're also hinting at, maybe, you know, you know, how Josh Cook felt, that in many ways, above and beyond, notions about the Matrix, he had really dug himself into a rut that he didn't know how to escape from.
Mhm.
And that and one thing I don't think we had time to talk about in the movie, but like he wanted to join, the military, and he got turned down. That one escape route after another, sort of got closed to him. And so as you're talking about finding ways to escape the Matrix, right? That he was looking for his and didn't find it. And I was really struck when working on that sequence, right? There's that moment where he picks up the phone and he repeats, that monologue that Neo makes at the very end into the payphone.
Yeah.
And, as I was cutting between, our footage and the scene in the movie, I was really struck that this graphic appears on frame in the Matrix that says system failure, because I think of, where Josh was in his life and the systems that failed him one after the other, after the other.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to me that feels, and you illustrated in this, you created this tone so nicely that feels really so depressing about buying into this answer for why things are fucked up. And you give this example of, like, every time there's like a super weird thing happens, this is proof of a glitch. But instead, I feel like that should be proof that there's novelty in the universe and we live somewhere exciting, not and the desire to want it to be everything weird that happens proves that we are something super programmed and controlled, and sometimes there's a mistake in it. Like, if this is a simulation, why did they build a simulation where we dream? Why did they build a simulation where what you showed in the nightmare is a possibility within the sim? If
Well, it all gets to a question which, we talk a little bit about in the movie, but I think there's still 100 other ways to poke at it, of, well, what's the purpose of the simulation, right? I know early in the pandemic, there was this on the New York Times website, there was this little animated sort of flash animation, right? And there were these little blue dots that were bouncing around. Like there was 200 blue dots and one red dot. And depending on the toggles that you switched, the red dot would infect more of the blue ones quicker, and they would all become red. And it was, sort of simulating the way that disease can spread. And just because it had the word simulation in its name, my eyes jumped onto it. Like there's an electrical magnet.
Yeah.
And thinking about, man, from the point of view of these dots, they're like, why are we getting so sick? What's the point of life in this world? Not realizing that they were designed to get sick, that that's the whole point of it. So bad things happen here, and it could be a mistake, or our response to it, could be the whole reason we're here. Like Paul talks about that notion of GANs, right? Generative adversarial networks. And what I loved about that was, and somebody mentioned this, like we did this Reddit thing the other day, and somebody, mentioned that in a lot of these stories, there's one, sort of primary figure, a Neo, a hero that the Matrix is built for. But the amazing thing about GANs is that the whole setup is that we need everybody, and it's sort of our cooperating with each other, or fighting against each other, that finds the answers to these big problems that the world was set here, that the world was set into motion to solve.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that's a very optimistic notion, that everybody counts and everything that happens is important.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one of the things that's always bothered me about the probability guy, right? He's sort of is the person who's
Bostrom, the philosopher.
Yeah, who has made this kind of, if it's possible to make simulations, then the probability is that we are in a simulation, right? Which seems like this very circular kind of logic to me, where, I mean, but wouldn't the statistical probability also say that we wouldn't know that we're in a simulation? Like it feels like it keeps coming back to people wanting to be the particular cracker of the code. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, you this sort of here. This is I'm getting an audience question I want to throw that maybe connects to this, which is any thoughts on how the red pill concept gained such purchase in far right politics? So,
well, I think it's pretty clear. I'm just surprised that it isn't used, as a metaphor for more things, right? Like, the whole idea of the red pill is wake yourself up to a truth, and it might not be a happy truth.
Mm-hmm.
It might not make things easier. It might make things more difficult. And, those guys took it for, to explain their worldview. I'm just kind of surprised that seemed to be the one that it settled in, right? I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of difficult truths, and some of them might have the advantages of being actual truths, could have taken that name, could have taken that phrase just as easily.
Right. In the sense that, do you mean in the sense of like this movie posited a world where you could wake up and realize what reality is and be called to action? Why has that language filtered down only to kind of right wing?
I mean, I think the language should be, I would think that phrase would be applicable to 100 things.
Right.
Right. And it's a difficult choice that he makes too. Like the whole idea of the red pill is you're going to lose this world, and you're not going into a nicer one. You're going into a more dangerous and more hazardous one.
Well, I think, but this is another of the fantasies of the Matrix, was that it's a choice that and I think when you look at all of the characters in your movie, none of them are making a choice. They're all, starting with Philip K. Dick, and then through all the people you interview, they are hit with a beam of, sort of Gnostic terror.
Well, I mean, Brother Mistwood has that epiphany, right? It's such a religious experience. It sounds like Paul on the road to Damascus, gets hit with this inspiration. Although I might say that Alex and Jesse seem to reason their way to it.
And they're still reasoning it from, Alex is in this crazy car crash, cops, guns.
This is what makes the most sense to me.
Yeah, and
that was one of the reasons and that was one of the reasons that contributed to each of their choices, each of their inclusions in the movie, right? That the fact that Mistwood talks about that sudden experience, well, the parallel to Philip K. Dick, and then to thousands of years of prophets, was completely fascinating to me.
And I think this is the thing ultimately that I feel like simulation theory does not, it defers its explanation, right? So maybe you can come up with I have 100% proof that we're in a simulation, but then it defers its explanation where you go, okay, so the things that built the simulation, is their reality a foundation? You ultimately have to rely on the same things that a religion has to rely on.
Until they crack the code.
Right. But
it's also very religious too, right? Like there's this feeling that any day somebody is going to find proof, that some Silicon Valley guy is going to say, I've crunched the numbers, I looked through an electronic microscope, I analyzed the data coming from an incredibly powerful telescope where you can see the universe breaking down into pixels, and now that we measure Planck's, this is going to happen and it'll be proven. But how many religions are like how many religions have had prophecies that something's going, the sky is going to open and the angels are going to come down. And that's going to happen soon.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been based on science until it's, you know, because enough people believe in it, and it's true. I mean, it's a peculiar thing when you're trying to use this kind of mathematical probability computers and you wind up in religion. And you know, I think the person that wound up the happiest in your film The Nightmare was the woman who said, I've become very religious. I put my faith in religion. I'm fighting against demons. And she's like the most at peace, right? She's not having these experiences anymore.
Well, and it's funny because, she's, very, she's a very religious, Christian who Jesus came and answered her prayer and kept the dreams at bay. And, that's not where I'm coming from. But nonetheless, I recognized her experience and wanted to portray it the way that she told it.
Yeah. I have another.
It's that X-Files, I want to believe.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the thing, that every character in every one of your movies is somebody who wants to believe instead of being tortured by confusion, they want to believe. They want to have the absolute proof that Kubrick faked the moon landing. They want to have absolute proof that dream paralysis is coming from a demon, or because that way you can abolish it or control it. There's another audience question. It's interesting that both of the siblings who directed The Matrix have since come out as trans. How do you feel this ties into the broader theme of video games and humans as constructs? And I think this also might connect to the questions we were talking about Red Pill and sort of what the original construction in that movie had been about versus what it became.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Certainly, I'm familiar with, how strongly people read, read The Matrix as sort of a trans allegory. And I'm often struck, watching, people play video games, how fluidly people, change gender when they enter those different worlds, and often it's frictionless.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What do you make of that, Adam?
Well, I think that the Wachowskis were operating on multiple levels, right? So they were trying to tell a story that was both religious and cosmic, but also about their own very personal sort of, ascendance in the world, like finding their own identity and being able to express it, which we saw unfold while those movies were happening and beyond. And now, with the fourth one happening, Lana, who's doing that one on her own, is like, really fully expressing her entire identity. So I think whereas the first movie felt like you're going to shoot your way out of reality, the third movie felt like you're going to love your way back into reality. That's sort of how that I feel like arcs out. And I feel like our understanding of The Matrix tends to begin and end with the first film. But I think that they were actually, every movie, trying to sort of transcend what they had said in the first one, which may or may not be an interesting way to tie into what their identities are.
Yeah, I know. I was so fascinated when I was talking to Emily Pottis in this movie, and she was talking about sort of the antidote to solipsism being like this close, physical human contact, erotic or otherwise, which led us to take another look at that rave scene in the second movie. That big, sweaty human love fest.
Yeah.
And how that's what, if the humans have one last night on Earth, what's going to be the best way to spend it? Ironically, that scene is, not only is it, science fictional and sort of the setting that it's in, but watching it, in 2020 and at least the first part of 2021, that kind of idea, that, how impossible, although desirable, does that 1,000-person bacchanalia look from today's eyes, right? If that's the cure, we're not quite ready for it.
Yeah, I agree. I remember when first seeing that scene in a theater, I thought, what is happening? And then every time I've rewatched the movie, that scene has become more and more important and becomes sort of like the central thesis to that whole story. And I like that you've wrapped that back to sort of what you're saying.
And if I remember that scene, it's also fairly, polymorphous, right?
It's got the way it's filmed has this incredibly like liquid, human, fluid feeling to it,
Mhm.
which felt sort of futuristic.
And it's a sexuality that's much more complicated, that's much more complex than straight.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, and I love that. I think it's a really important antidote to solipsism is human connection. And so that's, I think that if you spend all of your time obsessing about are you the only person in reality, it will feel more and more true. But if
Yeah.
you find a way to love and be loved, you will break out of that in a sort of post-philosophical way.
Well, and you don't just get that at raves. I'm sure you get it at in mosh pits and political protests, and in the audience of the Super Bowl, I suppose, if you're into sports.
Yeah.
That
Or
that
just or hugging another person on the street, which is, sadly a thing we can't do right now, but hopefully, hopefully soon enough we will.
Yeah, it's weird because in some ways, the movie talks a lot about the dangers of these screens, but I'm not blind to the fact of what an important coping mechanism they've been, this past year.
Right. Absolutely.
Even if they leave us a little fried around the edges.
Oh yeah. I mean, if we were just in a lone room, we'd truly be brains in a vat without these windows to say hi to each other. Well, I think maybe we should leave it there, man. I think this has been an amazing conversation, and thank you for chatting with me in public like this.
And next time in person.
Yeah, hopefully so. God, I miss it.
Right.
All right. Well, I think we're gonna sign off. So thank you, everybody, for watching. And if you haven't seen it yet, please see Rodney's movie A Glitch in the Matrix and check out his other films, Room 237 and The Nightmare as well, because I really love how they're all so interconnected in theme and structure. All right, great talking to you. Take care, man.
You too. Thanks.